over to the next page, please. Right. So as I mentioned, the case interview tests those three qualities, and so there are definitely some specific like questions that we are looking at in terms of understanding poison presence, listening skills, ability to organize things. So in the case, obviously, what happens is you're given a lot of information in a very small amount of time. So keeping that organized and making sense out of it, even after all of that information and calculations are done, is an important ability. So those are some of the things that we are definitely looking for. And then obviously the final point on creativity. Now, a lot of people kind of disregard creativity to an extent, in the sense that case interview is a test of ability to analytically structure a problem and solve it. Yes, but even within that, there are ways that we can be creative, thinking outside of the box, thinking about issues that are maybe not presented in the case itself. All of those factors are considered as a way of creative thinking, and are very helpful and very relevant. Cool. So in terms of best practices, so how do we ace the case, so as to say, beyond the case in point? But uh, there are some key things to remember. I think some of these are kind of a given, but I'll just reiterate for everybody's um, benefit here is the professionalism aspect is critical, ensuring that your dress code is professional, any kind of backgrounds that you use in a virtual setting are professional, is all important because it contributes to the poison presence and gives a good impression of the candidate. Ensuring that you're on time, and ensuring that the technology is up to standards is also a critical thing. And then finally, this is kind of important for the virtual interview in particular, is a camera angle. Kind of doing a dry run with a camera angle, understanding how you look while you're presenting is important. In fact, Emily and I did a dry run of our camera angles just before this, so it's something which is so ingrained in us that we just do it, but it's something to keep in mind for the virtual world that we are all in now. Cool. The final thing is on note taking, and this is where everybody has their own method, frankly, and that's fine as long as you're able to keep things organized and structured. It doesn't matter. Uh, we do recommend some method to the madness, if you will. So my personal favorite is actually having 3 sheets of paper. So the first sheet of paper, I will have the prompt and the framework and the structure. The second page I will use for all the calculations and the math. And the third page I use to note down any kind of mini synthesis. So any insights that you uncovered during the case, you note it down on the third page, so that at the end, when you do the synthesis and summary of the case, you're able to quickly identify the key nuggets that you want to include in the synthesis. So that's my style. Again, different people have different style, and I definitely invite Arjun and Emily to share any of their personal favorites.
I have a very similar method, making sure that you are highlighting what's the conclusion and the so what behind everything, and definitely making sure that you section out the page so you take time and take a break in between to make sure you're gathering your thoughts as well as a good method. So you're not just running through everything, making sure that you're taking your time and making syntheses throughout the case and not just at the end.
No, I think that's a valid point, Emily. I think making sure that you're essentially capturing the what ifs from every analysis and noting it down somewhere essentially lets you keep track of how the case is progressing and essentially synthesizing it at the end of the day. So that is my takeaway as well. But over to you, Mihir.
Cool. So let's see some of this in action. I think that's the best way to actually get a hang of it. And of course, practicing on your own is obviously critical here. But what Emily and I are going to do is a little bit of a simulation of what a case interview could look like. I've been on both sides of the table. I've done more than 50 case interviews, and so I'm going to be the interviewer, and Emily's going to be the interviewee. So, Emily, whenever you're ready, we can get started.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Cool. So our client, Big Bolt, is a manufacturer of home improvement tools, saws and drills. It was founded 30 years ago, and it became a formidable player in the market with consistent performance and a series of acquisitions. Um, its success is exemplified by the entry into the Fortune 500 companies in 2019. However, in the last 2 years, the client has been underperforming, and especially compared to their peers, and their profitability has dropped 20%, um, which has impacted their shareholder value. Uh, Therefore, they have gathered a lot of bad press, and the board was forced to change the CEO and the leadership team. They brought in a new chief supply chain officer, and that's been challenged by the CEO to take 200 million cost out of the supply chain in the next 6 to 12 months. Facing this steep target in this time frame, the client has obviously turned to us for assistance, and their main ask is to identify the main drivers to reduce the cost in the supply chain. Um, and so, how would you do it?
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity to collaborate with Bill Bold, such a successful performer in the home improvement tool market. I would like to take this time to ensure that I understand the full scope of the situation before moving into any potential hypotheses. So although Build Bold has historically been a top performer, within the past 2 years, Build Bold has been underperforming compared to its competitors. You mentioned that the profitability has dropped by 20%. Can you please confirm the time span of the decrease?
Yeah, the 20% drop is over the last 2 years.
Okay, over the last 2 years. Thank you.
Yep.
So with this challenging situation, the chief supply chain officer has the objective to reduce spend by $200 million. And to do so, our task is to identify the areas of opportunity to reduce this spend. Can you please confirm that's the correct objective?
Yeah.
All right. Is there any other objectives or targets to be aware of as we move forward?
Not at this point.
All right. Can I have a moment to gather my thoughts, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, so while thinking about the profitability dropping, we can look at the profitability equation, revenue minus expenses. Profitability dropping can be a decrease in revenue or an increase of an expense. But with our current situation and our goals, I would like to focus specifically on the expenses and the costs within supply chain. So thinking about costs within supply chain, I'm thinking about it in the 4 different tiers of planning, sourcing, manufacturing, and deliver. Although planning doesn't have many changes in costs, and there isn't too much to look at that, so I'd like to focus on the last 3 of sourcing, manufacturing, and deliver. So starting off with sourcing, I'm thinking about indirect and direct. Indirect can be looking at the variables of raw materials, the packaging, and different components that we're sourcing. I'm sorry, that was direct. And then indirect can be more of the services and external sources that we're bringing in. Moving into manufacturing, we can look at the 3 buckets of physical assets, labor, and utilities. And then lastly, moving into deliver, we can look at the logistics behind our current products, and then also the footprint in the DC network. Do you know anything about these individual cost units that we can compare to either historical data or benchmark data?
Yeah. But before we go to there, like one question for you, Emily. Like you said, planning doesn't really have any cost. Is that true?
It does have costs, and it definitely impacts down the line of inventory and other cost buckets. But with the individual services that we're putting under the planning bucket, that doesn't seem to have much change that we would see just within a 2-year decline.
Okay. Yeah, so regarding the cost buckets that you asked, that makes sense. I don't have the breakdown, but what I do have is kind of an overall cost per unit and a breakdown, a rough percentage breakdown across the different buckets. So I can give that to you if that would help you.
Yes, definitely.
Cool. So you were to go to the next page. Yeah, these are the buckets that you highlighted. Um, and if we were to go to the next page, we have the cost. Yep. So here we have our total cost for our client, Big Bold, $9.8 per pound as the unit cost. And the breakdown is given in the table.
So looking at this information, I think it's important to look at the individual costs. And the way to do so is we have the data for the total cost and then the percentage. So the way that I'm thinking about this equation is figuring out the unit cost per pound per category by multiplying the percentage of the unit cost times the total cost. And I would do that for both Build Bold and the benchmark to make a comparison.
Yep, that sounds like a plan.
Can I have a moment to think through the math?
Absolutely.
Okay, now that I've got through the math, I'll go down by category, starting with Build Bold and then the benchmark. So for raw materials, I multiplied the 50% times the total of 9.8, getting 4.9. For the benchmark, I did similar with 40% times the 9.2, getting 3.7. And it's important to note that the raw materials for Build Bold is higher than benchmark, so we can make conclusions moving forward with that. Moving on to packaging, 30% times the 9.8 is 2.9. And then for the benchmark, 30% of packaging times the 9.2 total is 2.8. Also higher for Build Bold compared to the benchmark. Moving on to manufacturing, 10% times the 9.8 total is roughly $1. Moving over to the benchmark, 20% times the 9.2 is 1.8. And then for transportation, 5% times the 9.8 is roughly 50 cents. And then 8% times the 9.2 for the benchmark is 7.7. And then lastly, for sales and engineering services, 5% times the total of 9.8 for Build Bold is 50 cents. And for the benchmark, 2% times the 9.2 is roughly 0.2. So in conclusion, we can see that the raw materials, packaging, and the sales and engineering services are higher for Build Bold compared to the benchmark.
Okay, and what does that imply?
That implies that we can take a total and see if there's a difference. With the totals, we can see that we are sourcing about 0.6 total higher per pound. But these are the areas that we can look into leveraging lower cost reductions.
Okay. And how would you estimate the cost benefit from this?
So to take an overall cost benefit, we would like to look at not only per unit, but now that we know per unit the difference, we need to multiply this by the volume. So do you have any information about the volume
Yeah.
that Billboard has?
Yeah, it's around 300 million pounds.
All right. So moving forward with the math, I'd like to go by category and understand the difference in cost, and then I will multiply that by the 300 million units to understand the total potential savings.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the raw materials, we are at 4.9 per unit, and the benchmark is 3.7. So that is a total of $1.20 per pound.
Mm-hmm.
For the packaging, we are at 2.9, and the benchmark is 2.8. So that is 0.1 per pound. Manufacturing is $1 for a billboard, and the benchmark is 1.8. So it is actually more expensive to manufacture the way that the benchmark is. With transportation, it is 0.5 for billboard, and then 0.7 for the competitor. So that's also more expensive with the method that the benchmark is. Do you have any information on why we are sourcing this at a cheaper rate, or why the data is any different?
Sorry, could you repeat the question regarding sourcing what?
Sure. Just in terms of manufacturing, so we see that the manufacturing is actually cheaper and the transportation is cheaper. Do you have any information on why that might be compared to the benchmark?
Yeah. So our manufacturing is actually offshore, which happens at a much lower cost per unit because of the labor cost difference.
All right, so that'll be good information moving forward, but to continue with the math, for the sales and engineering, it is about 5 cents for billboard, and then 2 cents for the competitor. So overall, it's about 30-cent difference. So
Okay.
now taking that information again to the next step of multiplying it by the volume, we'll be able to understand the total savings that we can get from comparing billboard to the benchmark.
Sure.
So starting with the raw materials, $1.20 per pound times the volume of 300 million pounds would be about 3.6 or 360 million. And then the packaging would be the 0.1 savings per pound times the 300 million, which would be 3 million. The manufacturing would be $1.8 per pound. I'm sorry, minus $0.8 per pound times the 300 million. Which would be negative 240 million, as it is more expensive
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
compared to the benchmark. For transportation, following the same, it's also minus 0.2 per pound times the 300 million, which would be also a negative 60 million compared to the benchmark. And then lastly, for the sales and engineering, would be saving 0.2 per pound times the 300 million, which is 60 million.
Yep, makes sense.
So totaling this all together, it would be a total of 0.6 per pound times 300 million. And that would be a total of $180 million in savings. So in conclusion, looking at this data, we can see that we just comparing billable to the benchmark, we're not going to be able to hit the $2 million in savings that we were originally seeing as our goal.
Okay. What are the other observations from this cost reduction? Like, why would you want to do the manufacturing kit or transportation kit?
So compared to, so that's a good question. I think completely changing over to the billable to the benchmark would sometimes you have to incur those costs to completely mimic the way that the benchmark is going about their manufacturing and supply chain processes. So sometimes it's inevitable to do so, but we can also look at ways to not completely take over the benchmarking's supply chain processes and only seeing if we can make the reductions within the raw materials and packaging. Seeing that we would be able to hit that goal with even just a proportion of the raw materials and packaging. Just those two together is 390 million. So if we can somehow make potential reductions within those areas without completely moving over to the benchmark, we would be able to hit the goals. But sometimes it's inevitable based on the way that the supply chain is set up.
Okay, makes sense. All right, so why don't you go ahead and summarize and synthesize the case at this point?
Sure. Can I take a moment to gather my thoughts?
Sure.
All right, thank you for the time. So looking over our original goals, the Chief Supply Chain Officer was tasked to reduce the cost of supply chain by $200 million in a time span of 6 to 12 months. So to do so, we were looking at the cost drivers, and we broke it down into the categories of raw materials, packaging, manufacturing, transportation, and sales and engineering. And we looked at how billable can compare to their competitors to see if there is potential for the $200 million in savings. So looking at comparing specifically billable to the benchmark and completely changing the way that billable works is the way that the benchmark does, the total change within the cost reduction would only be $180 million. So with our recommendation, we recommend that we look specifically not into changing the way that billable supply chain is compared to the benchmark, but how we can look specifically into the areas of cost reduction. So looking at this, we can see that the raw materials and the packaging have the greatest opportunities for cost reduction. With those two alone, we see around $390 million in cost reduction. So we can focus in these two areas and see how we can still maintain the way that our offshore manufacturing is working, and how we can look within those raw materials and packaging to reduce their cost reductions rather than completely switching over to the benchmark. Another thing that we can do moving forward is looking into if there's other benchmarks, other competitors that we can add into the mix that have very similar manufacturing processes of offshoring, even if it's not specifically the same within the industry, but if there's any other companies that have very similar manufacturing processes that we can use as a similar benchmark to reduce these costs and how they've reduced their costs over the last 2 years, as a lot of different companies are going through supply chain issues with the way that everything's changing in the world right now.
Well said. All right. I think that's a very good demonstration of how a case is usually conducted. Both the back and forth. A couple call outs from my side, or observations, reactions from my side before I hand it to Arjun and Emily to share their thoughts as well. So, a couple things. One is that the interviewer will ask you questions like I asked in the middle, which were to explain or get a little bit deeper into some of the insights that you're seeing as you uncover the math and everything. So be prepared to talk about observations on what something may make sense, something may not make sense, all of that. So that's one. Second, there were a couple times that we saw Emily started to do the math, got a little bit tripped up, but then was able to recover. I think the key thing is ultimately you want to double check the work, be able to recover, and then end up with the right solution. So it doesn't. So even if you kind of make a mistake, but you catch it, that's perfectly fine. It's as long as you are able to recover, it's all good. And most importantly, what we're looking for is the process that you're following and the approach, rather than the final answer. So if you follow the right process and you follow the right approach, then that's what we're really looking for, is the ability to go in a structured fashion, just like Emily did, clearing out all the different cost buckets, going step by step into each of them, and then identifying the opportunities across each. So that's just a couple observations from my side. Arjun and Emily, any reactions, observation, tips, anything from your side?
I can go here. I think there were a lot of questions posed around what is the timing that we need to take essentially to think through the various questions. The ballpark, there is no accurate answer here, but at the end of the day, you cannot take like 5 minutes to just think about one question and then come back. So the ballpark number is around 60 to 90 seconds. And that is around the time when you have synthesized and assimilated the data together. And you essentially present the data in a coherent fashion. I think that is what we are looking for at the end of the day. And especially when it comes to the structuring segment, if you can kindly move to that particular page, we can essentially see that it has been broken out by various categories of the supply chain itself. And she essentially, Emily, talked about the various aspects of supply chain. It was broken out in a manner that it is very messy in framework, but at the end of the day, even if she did miss out on certain aspects, it would be easy to enable her to think through that aspect as well if she had essentially left out on anything. But having said that, those are my two quick observations or just comments to the group when you essentially think about case interview. But Emily, any thoughts from your end after taking this case?
Yeah, I think most of what you guys said summarizes everything. I think you can even see while I was doing the case that it's important to take a step back from the math or whatever you're really deep diving into to summarize what the important parts are. And I know there's a question about like what does the what if mean, or the so what, I guess. And I think at the end of every part of the case, it's important to state the so what, because that's also going to trigger the interviewer to move on to the next part of the case and to dive deeper into questions. And that's really where you'll show your critical thinking as well.
Perfect. I think there was another question in the chat about what does the unit delta cost come from and how are these numbers calculated? Those are essentially the uh, difference between the benchmark unit cost versus the build board unit cost. And that is just calculate what is the delta in the various subcategories mentioned in the table over there. Sorry, someone was speaking something when I interrupted.
It was me. Go for it. Keep, yeah, continue. I was just jumping into, you know, I think thank you for walking through it. I know that we got a lot of questions. And I see all of you are able to answer them here, so definitely feel free to jump in. I was looking at some of the questions, and one I thought was maybe good to direct towards all of you is just around, you know, what this case is about and what knowledge you need to have prior to coming into a case. So maybe you could talk through, you know, again, do you need to have in this situation, know about supply chain? How much did you know about manufacturing? You know, as you go into these interviews, do you need to know the topic or do you need to know the background? Maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll take it. General expectation is to not know all the details. That said, some general background, like at least a little bit of an idea about a supply chain or how businesses operate is going to be important because ultimately we are solving business problems. So, you know, having a little bit of understanding of P&L, like profit and loss, revenue, um, cost and general cost buckets, fixed cost, variable cost, and then across them, certain buckets it is going to be helpful, even within supply chain, like manufacturing, transportation, warehousing. Those are um, things that one would expect to know at least at a high level. Though it's perfectly okay to ask the interviewer to help you with those segmentations and those buckets if you get tripped up. And you can always say, hey, I'm not an expert in this particular industry, but can you help me? I want to segment the cost for this particular bucket. Can you help me get the right segments? Because I'm not very knowledgeable about this industry, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think just to add on to what Mihir said, it's more about the coachability aspect that we look for. So if you're willing to take in the inputs from the interviewer and essentially uh, structure your case or solution around that, I think that is what is more relevant or more applicable to a good candidate, I would say. And yeah, I see a question posted to me in the chat about the analytics role. Is it different from the consultant role, and is it the same interview process with the case interview, etc.? So let me start from the back end. Yeah, it is the same case interview. We do have a case interview, behavioral interview. There's nothing much different. And as an analytics consultant, I think we are general consultants at the end of the day. We are all consultants. We need to solve business problems. Where we bring in our expertise is more along the fact that we are good at handling data and we are good at handling large volume of data and analyzing trends and insights from that. But apart from that, we do everything similar to what a general consultant does. But I hope that answers your question over there.
I got a question privately saying, could a candidate only focus on the three areas where Big Bold had a cost advantage, raw materials, packaging, sales, engineering, and only calculate those? Or should we calculate it all? I think it's a great question. And in fact, that is the first step that you probably need to take and say, hey, why can't we just get the benefits without really taking the cost hits on manufacturing and transportation? But then the interviewer will probably chime in and say, hey, that won't be possible, it won't be realistic because it's a trade-off. You get the benefits, but you have to give up something. And so absolutely that's the right approach to go after first, and then course correct based on the interview guidance.
Great.
I
Go ahead,
received
Mihir.
another, sorry, I
Go ahead.
received another private question. How would note sharing by the interviewee be incorporated in the case interview? Is it a good practice? Yes, absolutely. User friendliness, walking people along during the case interview is a critical skill set and a critical component of evaluation as well. So to the extent possible, you are able to do this as a dialogue, share your notes, share your observations. If that means you need to hold up your paper, please do so. And anything which helps is the interviewer follow along your thought process is going to be beneficial. And in fact, Emily did some of that orally. She didn't like hold up a paper, but she was pausing after every bit of calculation, saying, "Is this okay? Does this make sense? Is this within expectations?" Those kind of like feedback dialogue is important.
Yeah, I think that's very important to note because I think a lot of times when people get messed up with cases, they get too far into the weeds before checking with the interviewer if they're thinking about it in the right way. So the interviewer will give you guidelines. If you say, I think this is the equation, they might, before you get into each category and all the math, they might guide you on the equation first, and then it's just plugging in the numbers from there. So it saves you a lot of time and frustration.
I have received a private question here on what are some resources you recommend for case preparation. So this is just my take. My personal suggestion would be to refer to any case books that your college or anything that you find on the internet. So if you search for case books, you essentially get out like various consulting cases that have been charted out, like mapped out all the way from the question to structuring all the way to the end recommendation. So you can just follow through the thought process and essentially build your skill on how to essentially think through business problems. That might be one suggestion. Another resource that I used was a website called Rocket Blogs, which effectively is a very intuitive way of doing this on the fly as well. But any other resources, suggestions from here or Emily or the team over here? I guess not.
That's
Okay.
helpful, Arjun. Yes, you can check our website. We do have some information there. I think also just practicing with your peers and then also others, as you get through the process with Kearney, you might get an opportunity to work with, someone within the firm to walk through some tips and tricks too. So just keep that in mind. I know we're up on time here, but maybe the last question I'll ask all our panelists today is just your last bit of advice, as we get into interviews next week already, that you can share.
Well, just get a good night's sleep before the interview.
That's a good one here. Mine would be keep this as a conversation as opposed to being a dialogue. If as long as you engage the interviewer and keep the conversation going, it's always good. Emily?
Mine would be to be confident. I think confidence portrays a lot, and the way that you answer your questions, and the way that the tone of the interview goes, and the connection that you have with people. So be confident. You got the interview for a reason, and I'm sure you're a great candidate. So show that on screen as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We will have this recorded and posted on our website, so you can take a look back through some of the slides and the things that we talked through. But enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with interviews.
All the best, team. Take care.